but they just lie. So I wouldn't rely on the Chinese to do anything they say, and the Chinese will barely be able to, kind of take care of themselves, let alone dominate the world.
The United States and China, President Joe Biden, President Xi, a lot of folks are thinking their recent meetup was a big deal, but not so fast. Today, we're joined by Jim Rickards, former advisor to the Pentagon and CIA and a geopolitical mastermind. He's got some different words for you. So we've covered a lot of stuff here in the US with election predictions and whatnot. Today we want to cover this, right, Jim? Why don't you get us caught up? What should we be thinking about this Biden Xi meetup?
So you have the leaders of the world's two largest economies, the United States, number one, China, number two. Two of the three largest nuclear arsenals. The U.S. is second after Russia. China's third, although they're far behind the United States. So normally this would be a summit conference of the utmost importance. But we have a problem, which is our president is senile, physically disabled, cognitively in decline, not really able to negotiate in any sense of the word, can barely process sentences and paragraphs. If you look at his press conference, he had note cards. Doing a little outline or something, that's a little reminder. That's not a bad thing. But he was staring at the note cards, trying to find the reporters, getting pre-programmed questions, giving programmed answers, and was only up there for 20 minutes. Not much of a press conference. But in terms of what happened, I think the background is important. Biden had been trying to get this summit for a year, through Tony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan. They sent Gina Raimondo, actually, who's the Secretary of Commerce. She seemed to have better dialogue with the Chinese than Biden, who was having none at the time. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, went to China. So there were all these points of contact, and finally, they got a summit conference. But President Xi was not even returning Biden's calls. The White House would call and he would blow it off. The only reason it happened was there was an Asian multilateral group meeting in San Francisco. It wasn't really about the United States. It was about this group, and they meet, all over the world, or at least in their member countries on a rotating basis. And it happened to be the United States' turn. They had it in San Francisco. So Xi wanted to be there because of his interaction with the other Asian countries, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and Thailand, and others. Those are important relationships for him. So he's coming to the United States. It's kind of hard not to meet the president. But they had been blowing up Biden for a year and not getting anything done. So finally, they had the summit conference. The most important thing on the agenda was not discussed, which was the application of artificial intelligence to command and control networks in nuclear missile systems and nuclear weapon systems. Obviously, a pretty scary topic, but a pretty important one. If you go all the way back to the early 1960s, there was a lot of talk about nuclear warfighting at the time, and there were two movies. One was a black comedy called Dr. Strangelove, and the other one was a serious drama called Fail Safe with Henry Fonda. But both of them involved, nuclear wars set off either by rogue actors or accidents, and that's been a problem ever since. I actually happen to know what how the chain of command works in terms of how you actually push the button. I don't want to get into it in a lot of detail, but it's there are Marines ready to shoot rogue actors, and sailors ready to shoot the Marines. I mean, it's pretty tightly controlled with deadly force. But if you introduce artificial intelligence into any of that, you can't really have any confidence as to how it's going to turn out. So that's what they want to talk about. They didn't talk about that. Obviously, the United States and China are both working hard on artificial intelligence applications. Military is a big one, although there are many others. So that didn't get discussed. They talked about fentanyl. Now, obviously, that's a major crisis. 100,000 Americans a year are dying of fentanyl overdoses. And it's coming in from Mexico, and the border's open, so there's practically no way to stop it. But it's to the point now. They used to make the fentanyl in China and then smuggle it into the U.S. Now they make the fentanyl in Mexico, but you still need chemicals, what are called precursor chemicals, and other equipment to do it. That's still coming from China. China made some pledges, but it's important to understand that they're communist ideologues and that Xi is a hard shell ideologue. He's the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. They just lie. I mean, they say stuff. It looks good. They might even sign a letter or agreement of some sort, but they just lie. So I wouldn't rely on the Chinese to do anything they say. And as far as they're concerned, this is payback for the Opium Wars of the 1830s and 1840s. You know, at the time, the UK had a trade deficit with China. They were buying a lot of stuff in China. They wanted silks and tea and porcelain and other goods. And the Chinese didn't really want anything from the British. So they said, we don't need anything that you guys make. So the UK was running a trade deficit. And this was a mercantilist system where you had to settle up in gold or silver. China actually liked silver. But the exchequer was seeing this precious metals drain out of the UK reserves. They said, we got to do something about this. What do we have that the Chinese will have to buy? And they said opium, because they controlled Afghanistan. So the Chinese said, you crazy? We don't want opium. And they sent the Royal Navy in, blasted open Hong Kong harbor, and got a large percentage of the Chinese population addicted to opium. That settled the trade deficit, but not exactly good for the Qing dynasty. But now, so here it is, almost 200 years later, about 180 years later, and the China's like, yeah, well, you sold us opium, we'll sell you fentanyl, and you people will die, and that's okay with us. So the idea that China's actually going to do anything about it is nonsense. In terms of climate change, which is a hoax, we call it the Green New Scam. China makes pledges. China is the largest CO2 emitter in the world. Now the science is the CO2 doesn't make much of a difference. It's basically plant food. I mean, trees absorb it. It's not the cause of global warming. It's not even clear there is global warming. There is climate change. Climate change is all the time. But the reasons have to do with, clouds, ocean currents, volcanoes, solar cycles. There are complex scientific reasons for it, but CO2 is not one of them. But if you buy into that nonsense, then you want China to reduce their CO2 emissions. They're building like 5 new coal plants a week. So they don't have much oil. They have some, but not a lot. And but they do have a lot of coal. So they talk a good game, but they don't do anything, and they don't care. It's not like they're incompetent. They just actually don't care, and they lie. So the really big issues were not discussed. Other issues were discussed. No significant agreements were reached, and the Chinese lie about it, so they don't do it anyway. And Biden doesn't know any better. So I would say the whole thing was, a show. Okay, it looked good. You got a 2-shot of Biden and Xi, but it didn't really amount to anything. Oh, now just to top it off, and I'll wrap up, Matt. After Xi left, after the summit conference was over, Biden was doing another presentation, and Tony Blinken, you guys see this video. Tony Blinken sitting in the front row as the Secretary of State, and Biden calls Xi a dictator. Now you spent a whole that was the exact word. You spent a whole year trying to get a meeting. The guy blows you off. Finally says, "Okay, we'll meet," and then the meeting's over, and Biden goes, "The guy's a dictator." Blinken cringes. He's like moving. He's like, I can't believe you said that. After everything we went through. So again, Biden's just out there, barely mentally competent, saying whatever he wants. He's kind of a mean-spirited, nasty guy. Kind of punk from Delaware. It was either a non-event or a disaster. Take your pick. Yeah.
Jim, why don't we stick on that line of thinking, because we have questions about China. So
Sure.
Obviously there was a meeting here. Let's talk about China in general. Is there any way that China avoids a recession? Because this will have big impacts on the markets if they can't avoid that. What are you seeing, or what are you hearing just about China and the markets and what's going on with their economy?
Well, they can avoid a recession by lying about the data, which they also do. But in real terms, no. Now let's define recession. Let's put it in the Chinese context. China had been growing at double digits, 10% or more, sometimes 15% per year, compounded for 15 years, going all the way back to 1990. 1994 was really the takeoff point. Deng Xiaoping did some major reforms beginning as early as 1979. There was good growth in the 80s. My first visits to China were in the early 90s. I was there, not counting Taiwan because I've been there a number of times, but mainland China, Shanghai, and I actually get out in the country and south of Nanjing and been to Xi'an, Wuhan. I've been to Wuhan. I was kind of ground zero for the pandemic, up and down the Yangtze River. So I've been around China, but I started in 1991, and so that's like 30 years, over 30 years ago. But there were no Americans there. I ran into Brits, Australians. You run into Australians everywhere you go. Some Germans, but no Americans, because it was not long after Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was 1989. The U.S.-China relations went into a deep freeze. Again, I didn't meet an American while I was there. They just weren't around. But it was really 1994 when things took off. And through 2008, China just grew enormously from a very low base. So you get that kind of double-digit compounding. Yeah, that's an enormous growth, but from a low base. But if you go back to 2007, kind of before the global financial crisis, if you picked up the Economist or the Financial Times or the New York Times, whatever, they would say, well, China's going to surpass the United States in terms of economic output. And they were even giving dates, which is a simple extrapolation from the data. They're saying 2031, 2032, whatever it was, the US is growing like this, China's growing like this, and China's going to surpass. And I said at the time that was nonsense. And the reason is that, yeah, that was the growth track record, but you can't just extrapolate from that. Economies go through stages. You go from low income to middle income to high income. The US is obviously high income, along with Switzerland, Norway, and a number of other countries. But there's something in economics called the middle income trap, which is you can get from low income to middle income pretty directly, assuming you're not utterly corrupt. You bring people in from the cities. You bring people in from the country. You bring them into the cities. You build housing. There's nothing luxurious about it. It's not much more than a dormitory, but they have housing. They have public transportation. They can get to work. They do assembly style manufacturing. We're not talking about the German auto industry. We're talking about like Lego style manufacturing, where you put things together. People say, well, they make iPhones. Well, they do make iPhones, but all the parts are made elsewhere. They're made in Germany, South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. Actually, 26 countries for the iPhone, and China just puts them together. It kind of assembles it, puts a case on it, and ships it out. So that's, I don't want to say easy, but that's pretty direct. But then the question is, how do you get from there to high income, meaning $20,000 a year per capita or higher? The answer is you can't do it the way I just described. That's middle income. To get to high income, you have to have high technology and high value added. You have to invent stuff. You have to find things that are highly scalable, that are original. The Chinese are not good at that, and neither is anybody else. There are only a couple countries that have ever pulled this off. Singapore is one, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, although Japan's, they had a highly educated population before World War II. They were decimated in World War II, but then when they came back, they had a lot of foreign investment, but they had a well-educated population. So it's very hard to do. So China's stuck there. So you can't just take those growth figures and go, oh, by 2031, they'll pass this. What's happened is it's leveled off. Now, China has slowed down a lot. They've gone from 10% to 7% in terms of annualized growth. They've gone from 10% to 7% to 5%. They're stretching right now to get to 5%. And then in addition to that, you have to look at the components of growth. So there's consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And there are many subcomponents in that, including inventories and a lot of other categories. But China, the United States, for example, is about 70% consumption and 25% in investment. And then the rest is government spending and net exports, which are very small factors. I know we have $1 trillion deficit, but we get a certain amount of that's $1 trillion in the context of a $23 trillion or $25 trillion economy. So it's not a big factor. But With China, it's different. Their consumption factor is down around 25%, but their investment factor is 45%. Now, investment's not a bad thing if it's productive. If you're going to invest in things that have higher output than the cost of funding, that's a good thing. You'll grow. It's not even a Keynesian multiplier; it's just a smart investment. And that's true for some infrastructure and building your first airports and your first high-speed railroads and all that. But China has gone way, way, way overboard in non-productive ways. Again, I mentioned I've been to China a number of times. I've seen these ghost cities. I've been in them. I've walked through empty buildings, and the Chinese, the communist people with me, they tell me, well, we're going to fill this up. This is the future Los Alamos of China, whatever. I'm like, guys, there's nobody here. And they're like, well, they're coming, they're coming. So my point being, they've wasted it. So if you take the 45% of GDP that's investment and you assume half of it's wasted, and I think that's a good estimate, and you use generally accepted accounting principles, you would write that off. They don't, of course, they just count. I mean, there is real steel and aluminum and concrete and cement and jobs. That's all real. But when they're done, there's nothing there. I mean, they've got a building that's empty, that's not producing any revenue, or a railroad station with 125 escalators that are mostly empty. So they're probably, if you adjust for that, they're probably in a recession already, probably have been. But now the numbers, even without making that adjustment, the numbers are coming down very fast. So whether China is technically in a recession or not is almost irrelevant. What is relevant is the fact that their economy is slowing significantly. A lot of the growth you see is wasted growth, so it's not going to pay off. They're doing all these stimulus plans. Wall Street keeps saying the Chinese are doing stimulus, buy Chinese stocks. I mean, Wall Street just wants to sell you stocks, but stimulus doesn't work. You can call it stimulus, but it doesn't actually work because you're wasting the money. So China is either near a recession, but whether it's technically in a recession or not doesn't matter because it's slowed down so much. It's not going to contribute to world growth, and the Chinese will barely be able to, kind of take care of themselves, let alone dominate the world. Which puts Xi in a box because the Chinese have a concept called the mandate of heaven, very intangible, very kind of spiritual, whatever. But in effect, do the people believe in the leadership? That's the mandate of heaven. If you lose it, you're done. And Xi, a lot of senior people are disappearing. They're either being killed or imprisoned or demoted, if they're lucky, or put in jail, whatever. So those are signs of a guy who's not very secure. So I don't, as much as Xi rings around Biden at the summit, I don't put a lot of stock in China. I think they're slowing down a lot. They're going to take the world with it.
What do you think? One last question on China. What do you think their next move is?
They don't have any moves because they're an export powerhouse. But the smart U.S. companies, and there are a lot of them, they're moving to India. Apple's moving to India. The U.S. foreign direct investment is pivoting to Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, India, and elsewhere. A lot of it's being sourced back in the United States. Our labor costs are not, put it differently, so-called foreign cheap labor. First of all, it's not really cheap because it's not as productive. But even if the productivity goes up, it's not a lot more expensive than in the U.S. and you got transportation costs. So a lot of major, tens of billions of dollars are being invested in the U.S. semiconductor industry in places like Arizona, Oregon, Texas, elsewhere. That money's not going to China, whereas it might have in a different time. So, and if China relies on exporting to the rest of the world, what happens when the rest of the world slows down and they don't buy their exports? And then China they never brought up their consumption game. They wasted the investment game. And foreign investment starts to move elsewhere. What are they going to do? I think they're in a very difficult spot. Okay,
there you have it, right from Jim. A lot of hype has been around that meeting with Biden and Xi. Might not have been much to do about anything. Also, the things that are happening in China, the big picture, will any of it come home to roost here in the U.S.? We'll find out. Jim, we appreciate it so much for you being on the call today. But for anybody at home, if you can, do us a favor below this, add in your comments, let us know what you think, or go ahead if you want more commentary from us here at Paradigm Press. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and we'll see you next time.